Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Spousal Caregiving, presented by Home Instead and hosted by the American Society on Aging. We will begin shortly, but before we do, a few housekeeping notes. I would like to direct you to the left side of your screen where you will see 5 tabs labeled Speaker Bio, Important Information on Group Viewing, CE Application Here, FAQ/Troubleshoot, and Event Resources. The slides for today's presentation are available for download under the tab labeled Event Resources. You will find information on how to obtain CE credits for this event under the CE Application Here tab, including links to the application and to the step-by-step CE guidance webpage. Please review before submitting an application. Please be aware that your time is logged and you must view the entire hour-long webinar to be eligible for CE credit and access the application. You will be able to access the CE application a minimum of 2 hours after viewing the event once attendance is received and recorded, although it may take up to 24 hours, so we appreciate your patience. If you are logged into the webinar directly using the email address you registered with, if you are not logged in with the email you registered with, you won't be eligible for CE credit as we have no way of tracking your online attendance. If you registered before the live webinar, you will also receive a follow-up email by the end of the business day today that will direct you on how to claim CEs and include links to today's slides and recording. As a reminder, you have 60 days from the live event date to complete a continuing education application. If you have any questions during today's presentation regarding the webinar, you can send those to us at any time using the Ask a Question box, and we will do our best to get to those questions in the last few minutes of today's programming. And now I would like to hand it over to Dr. Lakeland Eichenberger so that she can introduce our presenter.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Lakeland. I'm with Home Instead. We are excited to sponsor this webinar series and to bring you a really unique topic today, all about spousal caregiving. And we know that there are millions of caregivers out there providing care and support to a loved one, a family member, a friend, a neighbor, but there's about 12% of caregivers that are caring or supporting an ill or disabled spouse or partner. And so elements of this type of caregiving really differ from other types of caregiving relationships, which you're going to hear more about in today's presentation. And we truly have an expert with us. We have Laurel Whitman. I'm very excited for you all to get to learn from her. She joined the Well Spouse Association as a member in 2014 and then joined its board of directors in 2020. She had a particular interest in reaching younger well spouses like herself. She became president-elect of the board in early 2021 and president in September 2021. She also co-facilitates its Younger Well Spouse support group. Laurel and her husband, Eduardo, have been married for more than 15 years. Eddie was diagnosed with MS in 1998 while he was in his early 20s, and the course of his disease was aggressive. He needed 24-hour care he has needed 24-hour care for more than a decade. He currently lives at home with Laurel, but he's also spent 2 years in an assisted living facility. So Laurel is experienced with a range of caregiving situations. In addition to her work and volunteering with Well Spouse Association, she's been a life science venture lender with Oxford Finance since 2004, providing senior secured loan facilities to biotech, pharmaceutical, and medical device companies across the U.S., Canada, and Europe. She previously volunteered as treasurer for CLAW USA, a nonprofit alliance of theatrical lady arm wrestlers focused on social justice, a unique group, and a Bachelor of Science in Commerce with a concentration in finance from the University of Virginia. And she and her husband reside in Church Falls, Virginia. So, Laurel, with that, I want to welcome you and to thank you for sharing your personal and professional experience with us today, all on the topic of spousal caregiving. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I am delighted to be here today, and I'm grateful to you and to Home Instead and the American Society on Aging for the invitation. So, as you nicely summarized there, I'm really here in two capacities today. One of them is as the current president of the Well Spouse Association, which we'll talk a little more about and share some of the resources that we can offer to this particular caregiving population. But secondly, I'm here as a spousal caregiver for more than 2 decades, which I think gives a unique view. And what I'm hoping I can do today is not just provide data points, although hopefully I will provide you those so you can take those away with you. But along the way, I also hope to share a little more about what the experience of the spousal caregiving is like for the millions of people that are in my shoes. All right. So, our mission at WellSpouse is very simple. We are the only organization that supports the spouses and partners of people living with chronic illness or disability. This differentiates us from many of the different disease focused organizations, which tend to focus on the patients who have the disease, as well as some of the larger caregiving organizations, which tend to focus on caregiving more generally. We have a laser like focus on the people living with a partner who has chronic illness or disability. And to give just a brief bit of background, and we'll circle back to some of the resources at the end of the presentation, we are a 35-year-old nonprofit. We're funded by membership dues and donations, although nobody has ever turned away for any financial reasons. Our community includes members from almost every U.S. state and Canada, as well as a number of other countries. And importantly for this audience to know, our model is one of peer support. So we are run primarily by volunteers, all of whom are either current or former caregivers, and most of our programs and services reflect that as well. Um, we are disease and stage agnostic. Wherever you are in the caregiving journey, we invite people to join us. Um, that could include people who don't yet have a diagnosis. It could include people who have, in fact, lost their partner already. We know that the impact of caregiving on people's lives is really, it plays a very outsized role, and there is a lot of support needed all along that journey. Um, the threads we think that bring people together in the community is really less about the diseases and where you are on that path, and more about the commonalities of the experience, the common emotions that you might face, the common logistical challenges. And our community has been developed as a way to respond to those challenges. And I'll provide just a little more background on me, although Lakeland did a terrific job summarizing it. I have been married for around 18 years, and with my husband for 21, I think. And he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis around age 23. And we met about 5 years after his diagnosis. I was 22, I think, at the time. He was still working. He was mobile. He was living very much independently. It was a very traditional dating story, except that on our third or fourth date, we were watching The West Wing together, and the president on the show had just revealed an MS diagnosis, and he turned to me and said, "I have MS as well." And I still remember that moment. It was one of those it gets kind of seared into your memory, and you kind of fumble it in the moment, and you say, "Oh, well, that's great. I'll learn more about it, and we'll just keep going." And then we did. Um, Unfortunately, he was one of the people with MS whose course of disease was very aggressive, and he was diagnosed at a time that there were not nearly as many drugs, they weren't nearly as good. And so within 3 years, he was using a wheelchair full time by the time we got married. And within 8 years, I think he was really in bed 24 hours a day. He now is in need of 24-hour monitoring. So we have an aide who helps us during the day. I do the overnight care, and I have monitors set up so that I can listen and make sure he's doing okay. So it's been really quite a disease course for us, and I really have seen it from the very beginning of his disability, starting all the way through to what is quite an advanced stage. So I found I found WellSpouse in 2014. It was too late for me to find it, which is why I'm such an advocate now about getting the word out about what we do, and what we can offer, because the realities of being a spousal caregiver are daunting. It is a tremendously isolating journey, and it's one that we do alone in the shadows without a lot of support, and with less support than other caregivers may be able to receive. So I'm grateful you all are here today, and I hope you'll spread the word on our behalf, both so that caregivers, don't feel so alone, and also so that people can find us if we're a resource that can help them. So let's talk a little about caregiving just to frame the discussion today. So AARP and the National Alliance for Caregiving put together a terrific report every few years, and in 2020 they reported almost 50 million of us in the U.S. are providing unpaid care for an adult family member or friend. Um, the best way I think about family caregiving is that this generally unpaid work is a major pillar of the U.S. healthcare system. In a lot of ways, it has a similar value to Medicare and Medicaid, which of course everyone knows about, and really provide immeasurable, medical and healthcare support to millions and millions of Americans. The value of the unpaid services in AARP's most recent estimate was about $600 million per year. The workload for caregivers on average is like taking on a part-time job. About 24 hours per week is spent on caregiving. And most families are also incurring additional costs on top of potential losses of income, et cetera. So it's very expensive, it's very time consuming, and the need for it's only going to increase in coming years because we have an aging population. We are doing better at prolonging people's lives with diseases that perhaps did not have good options in the past, and because of the shortages of paid caregivers. So, within the family caregiving context, around 6 million people in the US and 1 million in Canada provide unpaid care to a spouse or partner due to an illness or disability. I suspect that this is an undercount for a few reasons. First, among well spouses members anyway, we would include anyone who feels that a chronic illness is impacting their life or their partner's life, as a potential member of our caregiving community. And it's estimated that 6 in 10 people have at least one chronic illness. Secondly, and probably as importantly, the roles of caregiving within a marriage are much more fluid than with other caregiving relationships. So there is an expectation, of course, when we get married that it's a partnership and that partners will pick up the slack for the other person. So what might feel like a caregiving task for, say, a daughter caring for an elderly mother, like the daughter is paying the bills or going grocery shopping or taking mom to a doctor's appointment, is less likely in a marriage to be identified as a caregiving task. That's just what you do with your partner. Somebody has to pay the bills out of the two of you, and that person happens to be you. Um, Now I'd like you to think about what mental picture you have for caregivers in your mind and what their care recipient might look like. I'm going to guess you're picturing a woman in her 40s or 50s caring for an elderly mother. That's kind of the stereotypical caregiving relationship, I think, taking her to the doctor's appointments or paying bills. But spousal caregivers look a little different than that. So the demographics for U.S. spousal caregivers, we tend to be older on average than other caregivers do, and our care recipients tend to be younger because generally within a marriage you are age matched, right? You're pretty close in age to the person you're with. Interestingly, you're more likely to be male than you would be if you were another kind of caregiver. That does make some intuitive sense when you think about the kinds of diseases that might become a chronic illness. For instance, autoimmune diseases and dementia impact women at higher rates. So, within a marital context, you're more likely to see male caregivers than outside of a marital context. Um, Spousal caregivers tend to be less educated, which can have implications for people who are trying to prepare caregivers for the tasks they're expected to do, medical or otherwise. And they tend to be lower income. So that means that caregivers may be starting out from a lower financial cushion in the face of what can be a very expensive prospect and path. So, to further talk through some of the factors that differentiate spousal caregiving, let me share the one takeaway I would like you to leave with today. And that is that when you think about spousal caregivers, we are providing more care and more complex care for longer, and we're doing it with fewer resources, and we're doing it at a higher personal cost. That's really, in one sentence, one very long run on sentence, what differentiates spousal caregiving from other kinds. Um, our caregiving tends to be more medically intensive. We are supporting more activities of daily living, and we are caring for more hours each day or week. We are doing so for a longer period. We are doing so with less assistance. It tends to carry a higher financial burden for our families. There are tremendous physical and emotional costs to that for us. And then the real differentiating factor is we also are at risk of losing the companionship of our primary intimate relationship along the way. And we'll touch on each of these and provide some support for them as well as part of today's discussion. So the next few slides, you'll see headings on each of them that are things that people have said in Well Spouse Association meetings or webinars or presentations or offhand comments that I've heard over the years that I've been a member. So I want that to be there to put a human face on some of these facts that I lay out below. The first one I put first because while this isn't my quote, it's one I've stolen and I've used it a number of times now because running a nursing home or an ICU for one is very much my life and it has been for a number of years. So many spousal caregivers are providing care on a daily basis. Most of us are. We are spending more time on the job, around 37 hours, almost a full-time job, versus the 24 that I referred to earlier, and we are providing more support for the activities of daily living than other caregiving relationships are. We are providing what used to be considered medical care, and it's usually more intensive than what other people are providing. So, to give a personal example, this is straight out of my life. My husband Eduardo had a bout of urosepsis about a month ago. It was his fourth or fifth infection in 2 months. We took him to the hospital, as we always do. He needs IV antibiotics to treat these infections. And fortunately, we still have one IV antibiotic that is left that works for him. He was in the hospital for around 3 days, and then he was discharged back to my care to help him finish the course of antibiotics. So, for the last 27 days since he left the hospital, every time he needed an antibiotic, so 3 times a day, every 8 hours, I would pull it out of the fridge, 1 to 2 hours in advance. I'd set it up with the tubing. I would prime the line. I would get all the bubbles out. Um, I would wait for the drip to conclude when it had delivered the medication, unhook everything, make sure I was maintaining a safe and sanitary environment for him. One night, the dial-a-dose tubing took 3 times the normal amount of time to run than it should have. So I called the after-hours hotline and asked for help. And is this an emergency? Is this something that needs to be fixed? How do we resolve this? Lakeland said earlier, I have a day job. It's in finance. I play with spreadsheets all day, and I'm good at that. I am not a nurse, and yet I'm being asked to do nursing and medical tasks with for my husband around the clock in settings that they wouldn't have been delivered in the past. We in our house are also staring down the potential of a tracheostomy and ventilator, which has not yet come to pass, but if it does, my husband will need even more monitoring and care. And again, this is the level of care that's typically provided in a very medicalized setting. But this is the kind of care that many spousal caregivers are providing in their homes every day. Next slide is titled, Is This Ever Going to End? This is a heartbreaking slide because for many of us, the caregiving journey is only going to end when our partners pass away. Um, many of us are dealing with progressive illnesses, and so every day that your partner has is the best day they will have, and it seems to go on forever. And we often, we talk about this in our meetings. We just want it to be over. Um, the heartbreaking piece of that is, we know how it may end. How it will be over is when our partner passes. But it can go on and on and on. So almost half of us have been caregivers for at least 3 years. Almost a third of us have been doing it at least 5 years, and that's a much higher percentage than other types of caregivers. For younger well spouses like myself, the duration can be even longer. Somebody who's diagnosed with MS at 23, like my husband was, um, that disease course for him so far is about 25 years long. And if he were healthier in the context of his MS, it could go on for 40 or 50 years. It's the entirety of both of our lives. Um, we have a lot of people in our community who have been caregivers for decades now, and it's it's a burden that's largely borne behind the scenes where people don't see what's happening, and it's tremendously isolating. Um, and there's no great substitute for it, right? We want the best for our partners, and the society and healthcare systems expect us to step into this role really without any question. Nobody is helping me. We hear this one too. Spouses are much more likely to be the only caregivers for their partner. Most other caregiving types do bring in some other source of paid or unpaid assistance. This may be for financial reasons. It may be because, again, the nature of our relationship leads to some sense of pride or privacy, that we are trying to be more protective of our spouse or partner than we might be if the relationship were of a different type. It may be because of the understanding of our roles within the marriage. But the system is more than willing to reinforce this this burden on spouses. Many of the resources that are available to other kinds of caregivers are not available to spouses and partners. So, for instance, less than half of the states in the U.S. provide funds for spouses to be paid as caregivers, while they will permit other relationships like children or friends to receive payment. There also tend to be fewer resources for younger caregivers. Most of the programs that are available tend to be for people who are either disabled or are older care recipients, and they may be less accessible for families that are dealing with illness that don't fit into those two buckets. They may have cancer, which is not disabling, but they need help and resources, or they may be, under the age that those programs are available for. My family ran into this last challenge, as my husband was only 43 when we needed more care for him for what ended up being a temporary period of time than I could provide. He wasn't eligible for certain daycare programs in our area because of his age, and having him placed in assisted living, even though he met all of the medical criteria and was an appropriate fit for that setting, required a special waiver from the facility. We were fortunate to be able to get that, but it's not a given that you would. And many families run into this challenge that their loved one can't be placed somewhere and has to stay at home. And then the other thing to consider in the context of this is that, go back to the comments I made about how we are providing more complex and medically oriented care than other caregivers are. This is another reason spouses often can't get help. It's too hard to provide respite services to medically complex patients, to bring in third parties, even though their caregivers may be at the highest need for those respite services. Even though it's obvious, I can't skip over the financial piece of this. Whenever I'm asked in interviews or podcasts, what would be the first thing that I would suggest we change to improve the lives of spousal caregivers? Of course, it's the need for more money and more resources. In our relationship, our caregiving relationship, it is really common that our partners can no longer hold down paid employment, that we are no longer able to hold down paid employment because somebody needs to care for them at costs that typically outstrip most people's salaries. And we are also facing increased costs relating to that illness or condition. Um, in other caregiving relationships, like a daughter caring for a parent or a son caring for a parent, people are likelier to be able to continue working or to have a partner that can support them and build the kind of financial cushion that we all want to provide. And this is another area where younger well spouses have a disadvantage because we have typically had less time to have careers and to build that kind of cushion that is so important if you end up without paid employment. So when we're talking about financial impacts to caregivers, what does that look like? So we are often draining our savings to be able to qualify for Medicaid for the care or medical treatment our partners need. Now, a lot of care recipients end up on Medicaid, but we are married to that person, and so our finances are tied together, according to the U.S. government, and so the impacts to our partners, um, our partners' financial picture are similar impacts to ours. We often run up debt. We often start missing payments for bills, and we often lose our jobs or cut back hours, or we have to forego employment opportunities. And we may be forced to move to a less expensive living situation, which can be particularly hard for somebody who, needs uh, a living situation that accommodates disabilities. The real estate market is always is always difficult and expensive, but many people who are disabled need single floor living, and that can be very expensive. Um, so we always have to come back to the cost of illness being a major burden, and in spousal caregiving, it's borne a little differently than in other relationships. We've also say that being his caregiver is killing me. It is literally true in some cases. Caregivers, unfortunately, are fairly likely, I think on order of 40%, of some people with, I think it was dementia and memory related disorders. 40% of them pass away before their care recipient. It's an incredibly high number. Depression and anxiety are very, very common. Spousal caregivers report more depression and lower level of psychological well-being than other kinds of relationships. Um, these are the reasons that people tend to seek out well spouse. I often joke that a lot of people find us the same way that I found Well Spouse, which is in a panic late at night, doing a Google search, trying to find support from somebody because I can't do it anymore alone. And I see the membership receipts in my inbox. They come in all hours of the day and night, so I know that this is the case. Um, one study I saw that I included here said 60% of well spouses who had a partner with dementia were diagnosed with either depression or anxiety during just a 2-year period, and they had not been diagnosed before. When you think about dementia being a progressive disease, progressive condition that can last for decades, you can see how common depression and anxiety must be among our patient population. And no surprise, the conditions where stress plays an outsized role are the kinds of things that spouses end up with more often than other caregivers. So, being obese or overweight, having high blood pressure, developing diabetes, dealing with, certain conditions that are also related to weight gain, arthritis, etc. You're more likely to end up with those if you are a spouse. This is another heartbreaking slide to me, and it's something we do talk about often in our community, that people refer to themselves as partial widows, even though their partner is very much alive. They may not be a partner in the marriage in any traditional sense of the word, and yet we are still married and subject to the rules and norms that that relationship entails in society. Um, Interestingly, in the data that I saw, I joke that love is not enough. It doesn't seem to lower the risk of depressive symptoms to have a very strong, loving relationship. Um, those two things should be viewed somewhat independently. That the nature of caregiving itself is just its own risk for depression, even with strong relationships. And not all relationships start with that kind of strength. Um, we also lose our place in society. Invitations stop. People are uncomfortable reaching out. They don't know what to say. They turn us down, or we turn them down because our partner may act in ways that aren't socially appropriate, and then we end up becoming more isolated and more dependent on our partners as this journey goes on. And I'd be remiss not to talk about sex, even though I don't know you all very well. The lack of intimacy is kind of the third rail of the well spouse community. It's painfully common. It creates a sense of shame in the people who want it, whether that is the caregiver or the partner, where it's not available. and it's largely treated as an afterthought to everyone else. What I mean by that is that it's not tracked and there's not a lot of data, but I will share a little of how we think about it here. I pulled this stat up just again to provide some context. So 83% of people with partners report having sex at least one time per month. And we have people in our community who have not been intimate with their partners for years or decades. And I'm here to tell you that intimacy matters to well spouses, and it can matter to their partners as well. And it's not just an important point for men, it matters to women, and it's important to a marriage. It's not prioritized, though, by the medical community. I put in a couple of points here to illustrate that. One is that doctors often don't ask about the subject when you are having an appointment or address the concerns that are sexual in nature for patients who have chronic diseases. So we all have the experience of short appointments, and these are again people that have very complex medical situations, and you get 10 minutes at best to run through an awful lot of medical issues. And your sexual health is one of those things that often gets bumped off the list if you run out of time. And yet it's very, very important to the health and satisfaction of a marriage. And where this tends to show up is that caregivers in particular don't even want to bring this up, even in our community. It makes them feel very guilty, it makes them feel a lot of shame. Um, but I think it is really important that we talk about it more and that people ask us about it, both as patients and as caregivers. Um, it's a multifactorial issue. So, intimacy's challenges come from several different arenas. There's one that you will see people talk about, which is that caregivers kind of see too much in the course of the work that they are doing, the tasks that they do. We're changing briefs, we're helping with catheters and wounds, we're in charge all the time. And it can be hard for caregivers to make the shift from, the caregiving role to being a wife or husband or partner. That's an obvious one. It's intuitive to understand, but that's not the only reason that spousal caregiving relationships have these intimacy challenges. The partner's illness may preclude it either directly or as a part of as a response to treatment. So, for instance, what do you do with a partner who experiences pain at touch, or has to use medical devices that might get in the way of an intimate experience? There may be cognitive changes that make your partner, for instance, more childlike. This is common with people who have progressive memory loss, for instance. Consent can become an issue during the course of a long illness. Is my partner competent to be making these decisions? There have been a couple of really difficult cases I've seen in the media talking about this, and whether one partner I guess raped another partner because of these issues of consent. And it's not it's not always easy to tell whether somebody is capable of giving consent when you see tiny, tiny changes, day by day, and you have this kind of expectation within a physical relationship. Um, some patients, due to their conditions, have hypersexuality or aggression. You see these sometimes in diseases like Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's, again, the neurological diseases. And these are issues that they're obviously off putting to the partner, and yet it doesn't leave them with great options for intimacy within the context of that relationship. So there aren't really easy answers for these losses if you are, and if you're unlucky enough, I guess, to deal with them, and a lot of us do. But right now, we're really not even talking about the question of sexual health in these kind of relationships. So I will share with this audience here some of what people do to find intimacy in their lives when they are a long-term spousal caregiver. If you are able to find it within your partnership and try new things, that's great. It's an option I think most people start with, and some succeed, and that works for them. Some people forego sexual touch and sexual intimacy with their partner. They forego it with themselves, that works for some people too. It's helpful that caregivers tend to be really exhausted. So that kind of activity, um, can be something that you can set aside out of your life, but that comes with costs. That's one of those drivers that can lead to the depressed feelings and the anxious feelings if you do that for too long. Some people practice what I'll call self directed intimacy, right? This is just what you think it is. And that can be satisfying enough for another population of people. And then there's the polarizing one. Some people choose to go outside of their relationship and find other partners. It's polarizing even in our community, but it can be a solution that some well spouses will use to find that sense of balance and care in their lives and continue to care for their partner. Um, all of these are difficult options. Um, and some of them are not options anyone wants to explore in this situation, even if they are understandable or might make sense. Um, but what's important, I think, is for professionals, not to minimize the importance of sexual health, not to shame people for wanting to improve this aspect of their relationship when it comes up, whether that's the caregiver or the patient. And for God's sake, don't tell us just to leave. Go find somebody else, leave your partner. We all hear that a lot. That's just not possible or practical for most of us. And it doesn't really address, the real underlying challenge, which is we want our partners, we want a certain kind of relationship, and it's not available to us because of illness or disability. I was reminded in talking with Lakeland last week on a podcast on this same topic that Facebook had a relationship status. I think it may still, that's called "It's Complicated." So I use that here in this slide too. Why do we stay? Why do we continue to do this with all of the impacts to our lives that I've described already? Obviously love is a piece of it. It's consistent with our personal values that we made a commitment and we feel, a moral obligation to continue that commitment. Um, there's a sense that they would do it for you, and so there's kind of the give and take of that, that type of relationship. We always hear people talk about their vows. I said better or worse. I just didn't expect it to be worse. Right off the bat. Divorce is not a great option for many caregivers. This is another area where, um, it's a bit of a unique dynamic among caregiving types. A lot of people have to pursue financial divorces in order to qualify for the medical care that they might need through, Medicaid or other programs. But even if you don't need to do it for those reasons, the spousal caregiver is often on the hook to maintain that their partner's, the cost of their partner's life because the state, has an interest in not bearing those costs themselves. So divorce is very rarely an easy solution to leaving the relationship, even if you wanted to take that step. And then finally, there aren't many better options for our patients' care. Facilities are very difficult places to be. Having caregivers in is terrific if you trust them and if you can have the amount of coverage that you need. But many of us can't. It is very expensive. The caregivers are just simply not available for the hours that people want. So that puts us on the hook. We are kind of the last person standing, and we have to stick around. So I'll shift gears a little bit and talk about what can be helpful for spousal caregivers. Of course, I come at this with the, the bias of being part of the Well Spouse Association and the resources I've found there, but I have used them for a number of years now. And when I say they saved my life, I mean that in really almost the most literal sense. And we hear that from other people as well. Um, so, what do caregivers want? They want three things, and spouses focused on these three in particular. They want more information about services that can be helpful. Respite is one of those. And the researchers who did this meta review also believe that spousal caregivers in particular need help removing the impediments to using those resources. That feeling that I'm doing this alone and no one else can do it as well as me can get in the way of taking advantage of programs that do exist or that you would qualify for. Um, We also need help making those programs easier to access. The second thing, and this is where I think Well Spouse shines in particular, is more social support from the people around us as well as from professionals. This has happened to me a number of times. My husband, when he has been ill in a hospital and he's in an altered mental state due to infection, he gets very belligerent and he gets very frustrated, and doctors will come to me and say, you need to talk him into X or Y. And and this is a stressful situation for me too. I can't talk him into anything more than they can. And yet that kind of burden is put on me, in that moment, without the kind of understanding of what, the dynamics of our relationship, and what it's like in that moment when he's in pain or discomfort. And even the person closest to him, can't really make that moment better for him. So the third thing, of course, is that people want more money, more financial support, whatever that looks like, more access to programs, tax breaks, paid family leave. Some of these programs that you can hear about at the highest levels of government on a state by state level in the U.S. These would be tremendously important to spousal caregivers. We would also benefit from more help from commercial businesses as well, to provide some of those same kinds of things, and flexible hours and the ability to do work in different settings. I'm very fortunate to have had an employer who has allowed me to take calls and work on my spreadsheets from the lobby of a hospital or from the hallway of an ICU when my husband has been hospitalized. But that is unusual, that degree of flexibility, and certainly not everyone has access to that. So to go back to what WellSpouse can provide to spousal caregivers, I'd like to touch on the three pillars of what we do. One, we provide a community to people that are lacking in that kind of community. We develop events and programs that are designed for spousal caregivers in particular, and then we are also providing our voice to join with other voices, larger groups, disease groups, in the caregiving advocacy space, to make things better for the people, for us, and also for the people who come behind us. So some of the aspects of our community are facilitating 30 peer-led support group meetings each month. Prior to the pandemic, these were all generally in person, and now they are a mix of in person and Zoom. We have support online through several different social media platforms to give you that 24/7 support that you want. And we also connect people one-to-one if that kind of very hands-on touch is helpful to somebody. Um, the events that we've done over the last couple of years have included a seminar on emerging research on caregiving trauma, which blew my mind that nobody had apparently studied the role of trauma in caregiving before. So I was eager to bring that to our audience because it's something that has been a challenge for me and for other people in our space. We turned that into a narrative writing program around trauma. It was a 6-week program we ran earlier this spring, led by a trained facilitator who could help us explore the impact of trauma on the caregiving we do. We've done meditation programs that are very short and designed to fit into a caregiver's busy schedule. And we've even done book and movie discussions. We all got together in April, and we watched ahead of time the new Netflix adaptation of Lady Chatterley's Lover. That's a very classic historic novel that touches on a number of caregiving themes and discussion about intimacy within a relationship where somebody is disabled. And it was a terrific discussion to have with a community of people who get it and think about things in a little different way than a general audience might. And then we also do respite weekends, and we do a national conference each year. Our next conference will be in October, and it will be online this year. After doing one in-person conference, we are finding people still are not eager to travel if they have disabled or chronically ill spouses. So we'll go back to being online. And I think the thing that is important to take away about WellSpouse as we wrap up today is the value of it is really in the constancy that we can provide. There are a lot of people who provide support groups. They may be run by, the localities, disease organizations, religious groups, but the programs tend to be brief and offered infrequently. So maybe once a year, there's a 6-week program where caregivers can get together and talk through caregiving. But what I hope you are taking away today is for that many of us who are spousal caregivers, caregiving is a 24-hour-a-day job. It can last for decades, and we need a lot of support and different kinds of support at different parts of this entire journey from start to finish. And I think that our model provides that nicely for well spouses. So every time I do get, frustrated with being the president of a small nonprofit on top of my day job, caring for my husband, somebody will say, I just attended my first support group meeting and it feels like a weight has been lifted, or they tell me that they've never shared their story before with anyone. And I just think saying your story out loud for the first time is such a powerful experience, and we are providing a really great audience for that. Or they burst into tears with a group of people that they've never met before because they finally feel like they are with people who understand what they are going through. So that's the value of our community, is in finding people who understand this caregiving journey and they don't need to explain anything. So that is what I have. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you so much, Laurel. I want to leave a slide up here with the WellSpouse website because we're getting a lot of questions. How can I get connected? WellSpouse sounds like a great organization, which I know it is. So we encourage you all to check out wellspouse.org. And on there, correct me if I'm wrong, Laurel, but there's information about your upcoming conference. Is that correct?
There should be, yep. We also have a map as well as a calendar if you're interested in looking up those support group meetings. You can look it up by geography as well as, when they meet. But don't feel limited by geography.
Oh, I think we might have lost
all from.
Laurel. Oh, Laurel, are you still there? Oh, can you hear me? I can't quite hear you. Oh, I can hear you now.
Okay.
I feel like we're that Verizon commercial from back in the day. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Is it better now?
Yeah, we can. So you were just describing how on the website there's a calendar and there is a place where you can look geographically to see there is person or virtual options for you to get connected. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Yes.
Awesome. And then somebody had also asked, could you just repeat the movie that you mentioned that you guys had a discussion?
Yeah. It's Lady Atterley's Lover, and it's a D.H. Lawrence novel, and it came out, I think, in 1928 originally. You may have read it back in high school. You may not have read it back in high school, actually, because it was racy for its time and even for now, but it very much touches on these themes of intimacy within a marriage. So it was a fascinating discussion we had.
I bet. Well, and I just want to thank you for bringing up that topic. I know on our podcast, the podcast is called Caregiver Chats. If you want to search your caregiver or your podcast app for Caregiver Chats, you can listen to Laurel and I's discussion. She touched on a lot of the themes that we did today, but on the podcast, we talked about how, intimacy is not something that a lot of people are comfortable talking about. They feel a lot of shame bringing up. So I just want to say thank you, Laurel, for breaching that topic, because I know it can be uncomfortable, especially in a virtual room of strangers. But, I think it's just so important that we kind of bring it up because it's a reality and it's part of the human experience to crave and want intimacy. And it impacts the caregiving dynamic.
That's right. Thank you.
And then you mentioned that there's a newsletter. Is that correct, that people can sign up for on the website?
That's right. Yeah, it's part of our membership. 4 times a year, we have a newsletter. It's called our Mainstay newsletter, and it is written by members of our community, and it's about topics of importance to spousal caregivers in particular. We also, provide updates on events that we're doing and general resources of interest, and it's both print and online. So if you're interested in that, that is part of our supporting membership to provide that resource.
Wonderful. And then somebody had asked, you had talked about respite,
Hmm.
and this individual, they run a respite program, and they're wondering, you had mentioned there are some gaps perhaps in respite programs. And can you just
Hmm.
maybe talk about those in a little more detail so that those that run respite programs, because I know a good number of professionals on this call might do that,
Yeah.
how they could accommodate caregiving scenarios that involve spousal caregiving?
Sure. Yeah, I think the thing that is most limiting about spousal caregivers taking respites is getting out of the house in the first place. We have a lot of people in our community that cannot participate in respites even though they would love to because there's no way to leave their spouse or partner behind. And our respites anyway are designed for the caregivers to really get away. We ask that you not bring, your spouse or children or partners with you so that you can get, remove yourself from that situation even if it's only for a couple of days. So I think offering a respite really does need to be paired with a way for the caregiver to get the replacement care that they are providing back at home so that they are not focused on that if they do leave. It's tremendously hard to get away. It is never easy to do. I've been able to travel a little bit because I do have terrific aid coverage. But the times I've really felt most comfortable doing it, and some people will probably be horrified, but I'll explain the logic, is when my husband's in the hospital. He's had, somewhere around 25 to 30 hospital stays over the last 6 or 8 years for infections. And I've actually been able to get away and feel that he is in good hands, that, can do what I can do, and obviously a lot more when he has been hospitalized. But obviously, I can't count on that, and doing that is still difficult. I'm getting updates, from afar, and if something happened, I would have to come back very quickly. Um, so that is really the impediment. It's definitely not a lack of desire. I think even the financial piece can be solved for a lot of people. These don't have to be very involved respites. Ours are, a hotel in a lovely town. There are activities planned, but it's pretty lightly structured, and it can fit a wide variety of financial situations that people might have or limitations they might have. Um, but getting out of the house is really the hard part.
Mm, thank you for sharing more about that. And I know, the topic of respite, a lot of people, they think, oh, it has to be 24/7, but it can be
Hmm.
then kind of those shorter stints, or even just a couple hours, a few days a week, just
Hmm.
to give you time to take care of you. Because I know we didn't really talk about self-care in great
Mhm,
detail,
mhm.
um,
Yeah,
but on the podcast, we talked about how it's often a long journey. And so it is important for the person providing care to make sure that they take care of themselves, which can be easier said than done, of course,
mhm.
but that time is so vital. I also just advanced to the final slide in the presentation where you can see Laurel's email address, president@wellspouse.org. I know a couple of you had asked, how do I get in contact with Laurel? This is such great information. So you can feel free to reach out to her there. A theme that kind of is bubbling up in some of these questions, Laurel, is kind of around the legal and financial
Mhm,
aspects of being a caregiver. I know you talked about the financial aspects. Or I guess, um, have well spouse caregivers found it helpful to engage with legal professionals, financial professionals,
mhm,
to kind of get advice or guidance on the best ways to approach these kind of financial issues that they might be facing, or even legal? I mean, somebody had
mhm,
asked, can you claim spouse as a dependent? Those kinds of things.
mhm,
I'm not expecting you to
mhm.
answer that question right now, but
Sure.
you know,
Yeah.
uh, is it helpful to seek out that professional expertise?
Yeah, absolutely. This is one area where I wish that we had a bigger footprint and more staff so that we could really be more helpful. And of course, in the U.S., you have 50 states and then and a number of territories, and they
Mhm.
all have different systems and different resources and different options. And, there are nuances to everything you do, whether it's financial or legal. This is probably one area, where spousal caregivers have a bit of a benefit over other kinds of caregiving relationships because if you are married to your partner, then certain legal protections are already built in. So that can be helpful. You are next of kin, generally speaking, for your partner, and you might have to designate somebody to be next of kin if you had a different kind of relationship. But yeah, we always do recommend, I always recommend that people seek out legal counsel in their state, seek out financial counsel in your state. This is not an area to do it yourself at all. Don't do what your cousin did because they thought it was appropriate. It's very nuanced, and every situation is fact specific, and the facts of your life will naturally differ from the facts in somebody else's life. And you really want somebody who can craft that kind of, the right solution for you. There are also people who provide bad solutions, So if you can find somebody who has, is an expert in the, estates and planning space for partners who have disabilities, especially where your partners are younger, because I think people are again used to a partner with disability or illness being older, a more of a senior. If you're younger, it can be very different. So always seek out those kind of resources and don't DIY it.
One area not to do alone.
Don't do it alone.
That's good. Yeah. And the support groups that you mentioned through Well Spouse, I know you have helped facilitated the younger Well Spouse groups. Someone was asking, are there groups that are, wives only or husbands only? Do you kind of group people together by like situations, just in case people are interested in joining, what they could expect?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that we are exploring more and more because I am getting that request from a number of people to have gender-specific groups, to have an LGBTQ group potentially. Um, so far, almost all of our groups are all ages and all situations, but we do have 2 meetings a month that are focused on younger well spouses, and we do take a very expansive view of what younger means in this case. It's generally people in their 20s to 50s, but they're dealing with careers, kids, family planning, friends and family, different financial concerns than the all ages groups. And then we also have 2 groups that are for former well spouses. So generally people who have lost their partner, because the impact caregiving has on your life doesn't end, if your partner passes away. But we're open to setting up groups, and because this is a model of peer support, we can set up as many groups as people volunteer to facilitate. That is our limitation, is finding volunteers to get everyone together and to facilitate the opportunities each month.
Thank you for sharing more details about that. And I'm really glad that you mentioned the former Well Spouses group, because somebody did ask, have grief support. And so
Yes.
we know that, once your caregiving journey ends physically, there's
Right.
still so much emotion that kind of bleeds into that grieving process, and finding kind of your new normal, and imagining, or having to actually figure out what life after
Right.
caregiving is like. So
Reinvent
thank
yourself.
you for
Yeah.
and then some folks were wondering, you said that there are potentially membership dues, but it's not cost prohibited. Can you just share a little bit more about that? Does somebody have to pay membership dues to get access to the resources?
Yeah, great question. So I always invite people to try the support groups, which is usually kind of the way they find us and test out whether Well Spouse is a good fit for them. So try a couple of support group meetings with us. If you like the fit of that group, that's great. If it isn't quite right, feel free to try another. We do ask people to join to support, our office and the services that we provide. Membership for 1 year is $39, so it's kind of the cup of coffee each month. But we know that for some people, that's still cost prohibitive. And I'll be honest, I hate having a membership model. And if we covered all of our costs with donations, we'd have a little different model. But this is this is how we fund a small nonprofit. And for anyone who does have financial challenges, they're always welcome to call our office, and they'll help make arrangements so that you can take advantage of these resources.
Thank you so much for sharing. It sounds like a worthwhile investment in just that peer support and being able to continue your mission. So thank you so much. I know we just have 1 minute left, so I just want to end by thanking everyone for joining us on this really important topic. Next month, we are covering the topic of driving, which I know can be another tough issue, talking about if and when it's time to stop driving, and then making a plan for what happens when driving does need to stop as you care for an aging loved one. So I hope you'll join us for next month. But again, I just want to thank you all, and thank you, Laurel, so much for sharing. We're getting such great feedback in the comments. People have found this to be such a presentation, as did I. And so I just, again, want to say thank you for the work that you do and for sharing today.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you both for presenting today. It really has been a pleasure having you. And thank you, Laurel, for sharing your personal story. We want to thank Home Instead for bringing this webinar to our audience. And as Lakeland said, you can go to www.asaging.org and register for their upcoming webinar, Driving Safety for Older Adults, on September 6th. And just as a reminder, please review the step-by-step CE guidance webpage to review the process before you submit your application. You have 60 days to submit a CE application for this webinar. Thank you all again for joining us today. Thank you, Lakeland, Laurel, and Home Instead. We hope you all have a great day, and we'll see you again soon.